Haha. Alright, so hopefully this is a fairly straightforward assignment. It's basically just taking the pen that you made last week, and ideally if there's like issues you still need to work on in the model, like the model's broken or like could be shaped a bit better, if you can, tweak those and try to improve the model as much as you can. As weird as it sounds, like this pen assignment is actually like a really good one to use for portfolios, so best to perfect it as much as you can. But yeah, basically fix any issues, UV the pen if you haven't already, and then you're going to make texture the pen as realistically as you can. I'll go more into details with that, but like, you know, work on like adding scratch textures, bump textures. If there's logos on the pen, you want to add those, maybe some fingerprints or something. I don't know about you guys, I hold my pen really close to the tip and they always get like disgusting ink stains on them. But yeah. And at that point you're going to light your scene. You're welcome to use, if you want to use an HDRI, you can do that. You can also just make your own light setup if you want to do like a little 3-point like I just showed you. Or you can do some combination of both. I've used HDRIs before where they're just like super dark and you just have to add in like an extra little supplemental light. Basically, light it so it looks nice and I can see it. And then render said pen. Specifications for the renders are under the what to submit. So I still want 2 renders of your exploded pen and then 3 to 4 renders of your assembled pen. I do not need wireframes this week. I just don't need wireframes. And also send me a zip of your, oh that's weird, a zip of your Maya project folder with all of your textures and stuff like that in it in case I need to like look at it and look at your texture files. So any questions on like the basic assignment for this week? Yep.
I was wondering if you could show how to make like a translucent sort of.
Yes. Yeah, I was actually going to go over that a little bit later. If I remind me, but yes, I was going to go over that. Any other questions about the assignment? All right. So I just want to, I guess, bring up or like make it clear. So when I say texture your pen, I mean more than just sort of assigning it a random texture and then like playing with slider values. I do want to see custom made maps with like scratches and grime and that kind of stuff for these pens. So again, if you just throw in a slider value and don't have like any maps going into that, I am totally going to take points off for that. Yeah. Any questions on that? Cool. And then make your pen look as badass as possible. I can't believe I actually wrote that on an assignment, but anyway. But definitely go through and look through if you like get rid of any sampling in your renders if you can. So at least if you're rendering in Arnold, if you have sampling in your shadows and like grainy shadow edges, that's something usually you want to look for in these attributes for the specific light that's casting that shadow, instead of a global sample setting, if that makes sense. And then don't be afraid to like get up really close to your model and like show off parts of it. Like if you added really nice scratches somewhere, again, you're more than welcome to just like, you know, zoom in on stuff that you're really proud of in the textures. All that makes sense? Cool. And then down here, I have just added sort of questions that might help you sort of think about how to texture your object or like look for certain details. So like, are there fingerprints anywhere on your pen? Where are they? And then it's always like, so a lot of this stuff with texturing is like, how is the object made, if that makes sense? So if there's are there any little plastic ridges where, you know, if part of the pen was like injection molded into a 2-part mold, usually that'll leave some kind of tiny seam running around your object where plastic like oozed between the 2 pieces of the mold. So that's something you totally want to look for, like add that in with a bump map. How is the logo put on the piece? Is it like a fancy pen with an etched logo? Or is it probably just like a generic plastic pen where they like stenciled the logo on so you get like a little bit of like a raised text with a slight texture to it? Is that text, you know, has your pen been thoroughly used over the years and is that text chipping off? This is all kind of just stuff you want to keep in mind and look at when you're trying to texture your pens. really, like, the goal of this is to get as detailed and as capture as many little details as you can and get as realistic of a render as you can. This all make sense? Cool. I see there was a anonymous Kraken. I love this Google Drive thing. Anywho. Alright. So really quick, I just want to show you guys... Actually, I'll show you the Maya stuff first. What the heck? Pain. Alright, so I'm just going to go through how to do some stuff with, like, transparency and other random things. I'm just going to use my head because it's here. Alright, so what do I have here? I think I might... I'm going to actually throw an HDRI in here because I think they just kind of make things easier to see. Skydome. Sorry, give me like 5 seconds. Wait, that's shoot. HDRI. Alright. So eventually once this renders, so I guess the first thing I'll go over is just how to make something transparent, since that was explicitly asked for, and a lot of pens have transparent stuff on them. So, alright, actually, let's do this the real first. Alright, cool. So I have my 2 very awkward little demo objects. I will assign these a new random material. It's generic standard surface shader. And I'm also going to really quick give this, so I'm just going to add like a lined, or like a gridded plane to the background of this. So in case I haven't mentioned this before, you can have Maya basically auto-tile your objects or your images. So like if I threw in a grid texture, I'm just going to make this like a light gray maybe, I don't know, light blue apparently. Gray. So if I wanted this to have more grid lines, which I do, and this works for anything if you're doing like a checker, a noise texture, if you're using file textures. If you go into this place 2D texture node, and you look under repeat U and repeat V, this is basically whatever number is in here is how many times Maya is repeating that texture on your UV grid. So if I set this to something like 20, you can see that the grid pattern gets much more dense. Denser? More dense? I don't know. Fun fact, if you're ever trying to make quick bricks, just hit stagger, and it makes like instant bricks. But yeah. Cool. Anyway, so that's that. Basically, I'm just going to get a render going. So I think the easiest way to make glass is honestly to just manually set up the glass. So if I just go into my whatever surface shader I'm using, there are presets. So in case I didn't mention this before, Arnold and Redshift and I think RenderMan, it's been a few years since I've actually worked with RenderMan. They all have presets for their materials. So like if I wanted to make this a balloon, I could replace this, and this is apparently what Arnold thinks a balloon looks like. But I mean, there's a bunch of presets. Like if you ever needed to make like ceramic, I could replace, say, if I replace 25% of this, you can see it still has a lot of the attributes from the balloon, but it's maybe getting slightly more ceramic-y. In this case, you can just replace. Oh, okay. I was like, I chose Chrome. But anyway, you get the point. So there's like a bunch of different presets here that you can play with. In this case, I'm just going to start with plastic because it's relatively. Where is plastic? It's like kind of generic and good, I guess, for this. But if you want to make this clear and like turn this into glass, you want to go under the transmission tab. All you want to do there is just take this weight slider, if you want it completely clear, and slide it all the way up. And you can see that now I have like a very sort of awkward, clear little object here, which actually looks pretty cool on the face. I'm also going to set the samples up to 3. I do find a lot of times HDRIs do better with like 3 samples instead of 1. Oh god, that's like killing my render time. But yeah. So that's like just very basic sort of how to make your object clear, or like how to make it look like glass. I'm also going to throw a circle in here, a sphere. I should stop rendering this for a minute. I did notice every once in a while Maya gets like really grumpy about having clipping through your glass. So just be aware of that. If you're ever wondering like why your glass isn't rendering correctly, it might just be because it's clipping through something. But anywho, I gave up. I'm hiding the head. It takes too long to render. Alright. So here's my lovely like weird glass ball and glass tube. So if you guys ever okay, actually, sorry. Having a decision. Alright. I'm actually just going to assign these a new material, because this is what's going to happen if you start from like a default standard surface shader. Alright, default standard surface shader, take transmission weight, set it all the way to 1, and you usually get like this weird sort of shiny material. Or it's like more reflective, it's less rough. If you need to play with how the background sort of bends as it goes through the object, particularly the sphere, you can play with the index of refraction. You know, bunch of different effects there. It's actually really weird. So because this is a physically based rendering engine, these values for index of refraction actually correspond to like real things. So I think the default is like 1.52, which I think is the index of refraction of glass. But you can sometimes, like if you need to do, you know, water or a specific material, you might be able to Google the index of refraction and like get the mathematically accurate number to put in there. I found a forum earlier about the index of refraction of Jello. It was like a physics forum, and I'm like, oh god, why? But anywho, honestly, usually I just sort of wing it until it looks kind of correct. For some reason, if you take it below 1, it just sort of does nothing. It just sort of like stops displaying your object half the time. But anywho. So again, just fiddle with the index of refraction until you get something you like. If you ever want to make a sort of frosted glass look, you can take up the roughness. So you can see that usually it takes a little bit longer to render, but it does make a very sort of satisfying frosted effect on your glass. 0 is going to be like super clear and super see-through. Any questions on that? Cool. You can, if you're so inclined, you can tint your glass. So if you had like a blue plastic pen, you know, just tint your glass here. So if you set your transmission up to all the way to 1, whatever color you have up here is going to be completely ignored. And this transmission color is the one that it's actually going to use. So just be aware of that. But yeah. And then usually, so the reason I added this like weird little hollow tube thing, because A, this is the shape that a lot of you guys probably have for like your pens, but also you will notice that if you look between this sphere here and the pen, it reacts very differently because you have that hole punched through this, like you have that extra geometry in there, compared to this sphere, which is just like a giant solid sphere. Which is especially like, so if you're gonna, I would usually recommend if you're gonna make anything clear like this, definitely try to model the inner and outer walls of this. So imagine you're doing something like a water bottle where it is clear and it's like a plastic clear thing. If you add like that tiny little bit of thickness to the walls there, it's going to allow you to make basically what looks like a clear plastic water bottle versus a chunk of solid water, if that makes sense. But yeah, that's pretty much transmission. You know, you can make this slightly less see-through if you want. But yeah, any questions on that? Cool. I mean, that actually kind of segues into my next thing, where like if you wanted to do, if you ever want to add like a fingerprint or something like that on glass, or if I don't know, if you're like paint splotches or something like that, you basically just want to add a map into the transmission weight. So I have some like fingerprint files that I just randomly have from my last class. So I'm just going to grab this amazing fingerprint JPEG. And you'll notice that it hasn't really done anything to my texture or to my render. Okay. And that is because I need to, a lot of times it doesn't seem to matter for like the diffuse color, but like roughness, transmission weight, all that stuff, usually you'll have to go down under color balance and check alpha as luminance. And once you do that, you can see that the fingerprint is actually showing up on my glass objects. I'll rotate this around a little bit. So you can see here that I have the fingerprint. You can actually see the fingerprint on the other side refracting through the glass ball. But yeah. So at that point, if whatever color I had set for my diffuse weight is the color that fingerprint is going to show up. So like if I had that set bright pink, the fingerprint is going to show up bright pink. Basically what this says is just whatever value is black here, in this case the fingerprint, display that as whatever the base color is. That makes sense? I'll take this.
Is this still in the tab where transmission is at?
Where am I going? So yeah, so the fingerprint I mapped into weight, which is under transmission. To get the very awkward pink fingerprint, that's just the base color.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you think of, so I'll map a checker texture in. So anywhere that is black, it's going to show up as, your default base material. Anywhere that's white is going to be completely clear and glassy. And then so whatever was black for the weight in your weight map is going to just show up as whatever the default color up here is. So you can set that to be, whatever you want. But yeah. That answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I saw it.
Cool. Gotcha. Alright. But yeah, so that's usually how you'd throw in fingerprints. In this case, you can also, so I'm just going to go in, I don't want to re-add my file in. I'm just going to find my file in the texture, in the texture tab of the hypershade, and middle mouse button drag that onto weight, and it should remap that for me. But yeah. So if you ever happen to, this is something I would recommend doing in Photoshop, but if you guys ever scroll down under color balance, if you have alpha as luminance checked, you can fiddle with the alpha offset here. So in this case, I can make my fingerprint, a little bit less, I guess less obvious, just by sort of twiddling these sliders a little bit. Where it's still there, it's just much, much subtler. But again, this is something that, like, ideally you'd probably want to do this in Photoshop. You do get a little bit more control over it there. But yeah. You can also, so another thing that I often recommend for fingerprints is you can go in and throw in like a roughness material. You can even throw in a bump map if you wanted to. So if I'll go under bump mapping, again under geometry, and I'll just throw in my fingerprint file. Once I find my fingerprint file. Cool. Incidentally, I love adding bump maps to glass textures. I think they look awesome. In this case, the bump map is obnoxiously intense. So I'm just going to go back and just set my bump depth to be like, 0.01. Even that is still like pretty aggressive. So don't be afraid if you guys ever set, you can see here there's like just a little teeny bit of ripple from that bump map. Like nothing completely insane, just like enough to be slightly visible. So like don't be afraid to go back in if you want to set your bump maps to like crazy low values. Like that's actually not completely unrealistic to do, honestly. It does actually, what am I doing first? So I'm gonna turn this into like a metal texture really quick. So I'm just gonna turn my transmission weight to 0, set metalness up to 1, and now I have like a weird chrome ball. Set roughness to be something a little bit better. And you can see, I mean, there's still like that little fingerprint sort of texture in there. In this case, usually for fingerprints in metal, I map it into, I'll map the material into roughness. And you can see, I mean, in this case, so clearly for this, I think I need to go back in and invert this. What did I do? Oh, because I see what I did. I put the wrong file in. Wait for it. Sorry. 5 seconds. Alright. This one to roughness. Back to my render. Alright. So theoretically I should be able to go in and... Oh, that's why I was doing that. So I was like messing with the alpha offset for my file texture, and that's why it was like, I'm like, this isn't displaying the way it should, because I was messing with slider values. So in this case, I was hoping for like a chrome ball with a rough fingerprint on it. In this case, I have a chrome fingerprint and a generic ball texture. So in this case, I'm just going to invert my texture, which again, if you scroll down, in the same tab where you import your file, under effects, there's the option to invert. Again, ideally, if you were setting this up in Maya, you would just sort of have the correct color, but in this case, invert exists if you need it, and that will, give me the more of the look that I'm expecting. And then at that point, I can, go back in and play with the alpha gain and stuff if I want to, until I get something maybe like a little bit subtler. Again, you can also do this in Photoshop. It's probably a bit safer to do it in Photoshop. But you can also edit it here if you need to. And now we have a lovely fingerprint on this ball. Any questions about that? Cool. Did metal, did plastic. I'm trying to think if there's any... I think that pretty much covers the stuff that would be helpful in terms of like bump mapping and stuff like that for like scratches and things. That would be helpful for this assignment. The one thing I actually forgot to bring up, I'm salty about that. So if you do have a glass texture, don't ask me why, because I have no idea why I thought this was a great idea. What have you done? Fine. Alright, I'm just going to set this to glass, replace, great. Example of the glass presets being really like bizarrely ugly, and like they just don't show up well. A lot of times I have better luck with deep water. Yeah, for some reason I do glass. Again, don't know why. And this is actually more obvious if I put in a single light. So again, give me like 5 seconds to add in just like a single light. But Arnold does this really bizarre thing where it's just like, oh, you have an object that's clear and supposed to be glass. You totally want that to be a solid object, right? Like, that's not clear. You have to go back in and manually tell Arnold. There we go. So, like, here's our glass objects from before. Like, it's the same glass texture, but you can see how hideous the shadows from this look. And this is, again, just, it's, for some reason, Arnold decides that you need to manually tell it to make these objects clear. So if you are ever doing something with like glass or anything like that, you just have to select the object itself. And under like the shape node for the object in your attribute editor, go down to the Arnold tab. And there's, again, by default, opaque is checked on. If I uncheck that, you can see that it makes the shadow like clear. If I move this object down so it's like closer to the floor, it kind of becomes a little bit more obvious maybe. But again, so if I click on this guy here, I'll uncheck opaque, and then it's not casting that like really aggressive shadow that it was casting. It might be kind of hard to see. There is still a shadow here. It's just like much subtler than it was. What happens? Opposite what I wanted. But yeah, so just be aware of that. You should go back in and set your objects to be transparent, so you don't have like a nice clear object with like a really hard shadow on it. But yeah, any questions about that? Cool. I'm like curious why this shadow is like so very, very. Anyway, not super important, but yeah. Excuse me. So are there any other questions about just like applying, basic texture maps into anything like clear, how to make plastic, like how to make a certain type of texture in Arnold? All right. If that is the case, I'm actually going to wander over really quick and show you guys Mudbox. Just like a super quick and janky tutorial about it. So there is a button somewhere in Maya where you can like actually send send to Mudbox. Usually I just import my object and call it a day. But just be aware this is here. If you want to use it, you can. It should transfer, I think, any objects that you have into Mudbox. Send as new scene. I think it also usually takes a little while to actually load this sometimes, but you can see it's dumped my objects into Mudbox. Again, I don't use this terribly frequently, if ever, but you can do it. So I'm actually going to go through. I'm just going to open up. I saved out that face that I was working on before because it has UVs. And you can see that here I have this lovely face. Super creepy. I'm going to very quickly. I saved that. I've just been saving things in really weird spots. All right. Prepare my Maya scene. If you guys ever want to change the background of your Maya from like gray to blue or whatever, if you do Alt-B, it'll cycle through the different backgrounds. Anywho. Ooh, God, what? Anyway. That's creepy. Alright, so just like a few quick navigation things. When you first set up Mudbox, you should be able to select Use Default Maya Controls for navigating the 3D viewport. So navigating in here should be the same as working in Maya. If you want to display the wireframe for your object, just hit W. And that will toggle that on and off. I don't use this too much. Sometimes I do just like visually see how many subdivisions I have. So again, looking at this model, like this is a pretty low poly head. Especially you can see like on the cheeks there's a lot of polys, like in this weird little head crease. If you ever want to get, like I think it's really hard to work on a low poly model like this. So sometimes I'll go back in and just add extra subdivisions just to paint on it. So if I do Shift D, D as in dog, you can see that it's adding in more subdivisions into my mesh, and just generally smoothing out the head. And again, I'm just gonna paint on this and then export textures. So any changes I do to the model aren't gonna be reflected in Maya or anything like that, because I'm not putting this file back in there. So when you open Mudbox, by default, it starts out wanting to sculpt your object. So if you're ever looking to save out like displacement maps or whatever, you can doodle on your object and then export that out like that. I actually, for some reason, I really like this hairbrush, or it's not even like a hairbrush, but like whatever this little alpha thing is down here, makes really nice hair. Oh God.
Whoa.
Yep. Nope. That is spiky death. Holy crap. I'm curious if the smooth tool can fix this. It cannot. It's too much. Actually, anyway, this is not relevant to anything. Sorry. Sometimes I do admittedly get, oh God, I crashed it. No. Crap. Okay.
It's a base tutorial, but we'll show you how to crash the program.
That is pretty much every class I ever teach. It's like, here's how you make and render a cube, but also my eye's gonna explode at the same time. Oh, good. Alrighty then. I might just make a new scene and bring in my face again. This seems maybe like a better plan. But yeah, so usually it defaults to sculpting. You can select different actions from this like bottom left little menu down here. It's just like different ways the brush behaves. They're pretty fun to play with. You get a feel for them pretty quickly. So not really gonna go over all these. And then out here is like alphas. So basically like different stamp shapes you can use if you don't want just a circular brush. Again, similar to Photoshop. I think I might need to force quit this. And yeah, all right. Hey, wait. Every time I like no, I'm just gonna kill it. So then on the okay. Well, that's anyway. So here we have brushes, like again, alphas. This is the size of your brush. Again, probably fairly self-explanatory. Strength of your brush. Basically, if you're on the sculpt tab, it's how much it's going to push your mesh out. And then there's like other stuff which you can just sort of fiddle with, just like how regular the stamps are and stuff. But anywho, so in this case, what you're probably going to want to do is, for this assignment, the paint tools are going to be more helpful. So if you go to the bottom, right next to, on the bottom left, next to sculpt tools, there's a little paint tools tab. If you select paintbrush and then just click on your model, it's going to pull up this like, oh, here's like a new paint layer thing. Base. So I usually, like, again, this is pretty much going to work really similar to Photoshop. It's going to have different layers and stuff that you draw on. For size, I usually start with like 4K, just because it's easier to go down than up in my experience. Some programs are actually pretty good about that, but I'm just like, start higher, it's safer, why not? Select your image if you want, or image file type if you want. And then the channel. So is this a map of opacity, diffuse, specular? Is this a bump, normal map, etc.? The downside to Mudbox is that it doesn't really support PBR workflow. So you can kind of like fudge it and get around it, but it doesn't. So like if you look at your standard surface shader for Arnold, it's going to have like a roughness, metalness. They don't have these channels here. You can still make maps for them because all this is really doing is just like drawing color values onto a model. But unfortunately, how this renders in Mudbox is not necessarily going to be how it renders in Maya. Which is like honestly kind of ridiculous, but whatever. So in this case, I'm just going to start with diffuse, which is just like your basic color channel. Gonna hit OK. So if you look over here on the right, like upper right of the screen, I think normally it starts you out on this object list where you just see all the cameras and like objects and stuff in your scene. If you go into this layers tab here, you can see, cool, this is my diffuse channel. Anything that's going to show up is like the color of my object. And I have this little face-based layer that I've made. So I'm just going to pick a random color. Maybe, I don't know, something that looks vaguely flesh-toned. I'll just set my brush to be like really enormous. And I'm just going to go and like color this whole model in like a crazy person. I'm sure there's a fill tool. I've just never been motivated enough to find it because it's so easy to just do that. So then at this point, maybe I want to go in and like, for some reason my personal style is like really intense bags under the eyes. Don't know why. Eye bags. So if I make a new little layer, again, there's a little new layer button here. You can see, it's made a new layer. I'm going to go in, set this to maybe something like bluish, because that feels like a reasonable color to have on a face. And just adjust my brush size. I'm going to turn off the alpha because before it was doing like weird sort of streaky things, which again, nice effect if you want this. Not quite sure I do. So I'll just turn that off. And then for strength, I'm just going to put that down to like 25 or something. It's, again, pretty much the same thing as opacity in Photoshop. And I'm just going to doodle on this face and be like, awesome, now my person looks like a dead person. Yeah. I never promised this was going to be a pretty demo head. Let it be said. But yeah, so now we have this like weird corpse here. And then if I was decided that that was like really obnoxiously intense, I think I undid, did I get rid of my layer? What is it? That's annoying. Shift Z. God, okay. Well, apparently I added that onto the base of my face. So let me really quick remake my new layer. Eye bags. Cool. And just redraw in my eye bags. My glorious, glorious, creepy eye bags. Anywho, again, pretty much just like Photoshop in 3D. If I decided that those eye bags were too intense, I could take this down to maybe 50% opacity, and you can see that looks slightly more natural, question mark. But yeah. So you can do that, pretty much add in like whatever colors you want for, like if I wanted to make the lips red or whatever, I could go in and do that. Set the intensity up, and just be like, boom, color, or something. I don't know. It's really, you can have a lot of fun with it. So the beauty of Mudbox is that if you've ever like had you like have texture going across a seam in your UVs, and you're like, I don't know how to do this. Like how to get the stuff to match up, and you spend like a bunch of time trying to get it to match up, and it just takes forever and it like doesn't work. So Mudbox pretty much ignores all of that. It's amazing. So like there's a UV seam, if I look at this head, stupid head. So if I look at this head in my UV editor, you can see there's like a big seam going right down the back of it. Maybe, hopefully you can see that. But like right down here, there's like a big seam. So if you're working in Mudbox, you can just draw across seams, and it's like doesn't care. It's just gonna like automatically make your textures so that they like pretty much seam up perfectly along those cuts in your UVs, which is super nice and super powerful. But it's really good again for like adding scratches and stuff for your pens. If you could do it in Mudbox if you wanted to. I do think it's a little easier for like logos and text to line that up in Photoshop. Personal preference, don't really care what you do. I just think it's easier personally. But yeah, so assuming that you're happy with that for the color, if you wanted to, you could go back in and make some maps for like specular or metal. So in this case, I'm just going to say specular. Specular is like the closest thing you can find for roughness in this workflow. And I'll just call this roughness. So if for some reason my personal preference is to start with just pretty much nothing, like start with no, basically convert this into a Lambert and don't have any kind of like reflection or shininess on this. So again, I just set this to black and just put a giant brush on it. And then I'll set this to a smaller brush and go back in. If you guys are ever doing like skin or like smudgy stuff, it's really nice to actually start sometimes with a brush like with texture on it, because you'll notice like that's just done with an alpha, but if you rotate across this, it does make like a really nice sort of subtle texture to it. I'm not saying this makes sense for skin, but it might be good for like other things. What if I just set this down to like really low opacity again? I'll just sort of go through, and a lot of times there's like sort of shininess under the eyeballs for some reason. Across the face, I don't know. I'm just doing like really quick, like weird, awkward demo shininess. Shiny mouth area. All right. It's glorious. All right. And then just do like some random test things to demo UV seems cool. So I'm just gonna say, cool, that's my shiniest. I guess I'm happy with where this object is shiny. So again, and maybe I want to make a metal map for this for some reason. If you're doing like texturing like a cyborg head or something weird, I don't know. again, there's no map for that. So the best way I've found to do it is to just sort of pick a channel and draw in it. In this case, I'm just going to throw it in specular and just design the map. If you kind of like know what the values should be, you can still draw the texture and it's still going to work. When you plug it into metalness, it's just not going to display as metalness in Mudbox, if that makes sense. You can actually go through, I'm pretty sure I didn't specifically look at this, but up here you can see your UV view of the object. So you should be able to like look at the different textures you've drawn in there. But anywho, so in this case, maybe I just want like a weird, I don't know, like a metal patch just sort of at the top of the head here. And I'm just going to draw this on. So keeping in mind that usually it's good to keep metalness at a value of 1 or 0, because it either is metal or it isn't. So I'm just going to say I want cobblestones on this person's head, because that seems like a great idea. So when I put this into Maya, this area here, the brush size thing in Mudbox is the actual worst. But yeah, so when I put this into Maya, I'm just going to use this as a metalness map, and it should show up, again, differently once I put it into Maya. But yeah, so any questions on just like how to use like, you know, size or like layers or anything like that? I feel like it is like fairly self-explanatory, hopefully. But anywho, so again, since this uses a different workflow than Maya, it's usually why I don't just port back and forth between Maya and Mudbox. I'm going to export all my file textures. So I'm just going to go to File, Export All Paint Layers, and then I'm going to override this path. And I'm just going to put this on my desktop. New text. Cool. So I'm just going to pick a new path for these to be dumped in. If you want to, if you have more than one model in your scene, you can export paint layers for, like, pick which object you want to export them for. For file type, you can, so when you make a layer, it specifies a file type. You can override that here if you want to. I just don't care enough. And then honestly, I usually leave all of this stuff pretty much the same, because I find changing it to be awkward. Basically, all of this stuff is Mudbox's way of pulling the information from this, from how you've named your layers and like naming your files in a similar way. So theoretically, if you've labeled these reasonably, your files that you export will also be named reasonably. And then the only other thing that I usually look at is down here for merge channels. So in this case, I'm totally fine with my face and just like having all of the weird textures that I've added on my face. That can just be one map. I don't really need like 5 different maps for that. I like separating it here because it gives me flexibility to turn off like the weird eye bags or whatever, or like the blue streaks I put on the back of the head. I can modify that separately, but I don't need them in separate textures. Again, like layers in Photoshop. So for diffuse, I'm just going to merge these guys. It's going to condense. Instead of saving 3 files, I'll just save 1. For my specular, since I had to do that like weird sort of hack thing where one of them is like a map that I'm putting into metalness and the other one's going to be roughness, I'm going to leave these separate. So I'm just going to export this. And then theoretically on my desktop, I save things in like literally every possible place. So you can see here it's exported the maps for me. I have my wonderful diffuse map, my very awkward metalness map, and this very awkward roughness map that I made. So if you go back into Maya, and again, it's like one of those things, like color import's fine. For stuff like roughness and metalness or anything like that, you're probably going to need to fiddle a little bit with your settings, either in Photoshop or in Maya. Just because it's using a different workflow, so you might need to like tweak the values a bit. So I'll just start a render of this. Grumble. All right, I'm gonna re-add in a sky dome light. So now I have my gorgeous render. So I'm just going to go back into my standard surface. I'll throw in the color. Just grab that from my desktop. And you can actually see, so it's labeled it based on the default material. Here's like my diffuse, here's my specular metal, here's my specular roughness. It labels it based on how you labeled your layers. So in this case, I'm just going to hijack the diffuse texture. And then that should export. Oh my god. It looks like hamburger. This like, I keep thinking of like, this reminds me of like something that I want to do for an extra credit assignment. I just like don't know. I don't know what I could turn this into, but it feels like something people would have fun with. If anyone has ideas. Anywho, so that's color. And then again, for specular, in Mudbox, usually that maps into roughness. So I'm just gonna go in, grab that file, and roughness. And this is probably gonna like make my render look really ugly for a sec. So you can see, so I added shininess to the lips, to the nose, and like under here. You can see that's not really showing up. Again, I need to go back in and check alpha's luminance. Once I check that, it does show up shiny, but it's shiny the wrong way. So this is like one of those times where I'm like, oops, my bad, I'm just going to invert this texture. And you can theoretically see if I rotate this head slightly so that it catches the light. There is maybe a little bit, oh, come on, don't give me that. All right, there is like a little teeny bit of shininess on the lips. In this case, I'm actually just gonna, I might actually grab, it's more obvious. So I did the same demo last class, and I have just like a, ooh god. I have a slightly nicer looking, what did I map that into? Dear lord. Anywho, I was gonna say I have a nicer roughness matte, but that's making a liar out of me. Anyway, alright, specular roughness stuff, good. Just gonna invert that. Theoretically, you know, I have some shininess here. Again, if I needed to, I could play a little bit with the, like the alpha gain for this, and try to maybe get punch some of those areas up and make them a little bit more shiny. I just don't really care. It's actually a good example of stuff not quite importing correctly when you take it from the specular to roughness workflow. So before you start doing stuff, it is usually good to like pick one that you're going to work with and then stick to it. But yeah. And again, metalness, pretty much same thing. I'm just going to grab my file texture and dump it in there. So while I'm doing this, there is another program called Substance Painter. From what I've been told, I haven't specifically gone into any of the labs trying to find it. But from what I've been told, it exists in 2 labs. I'm not sure which. But it, in my opinion, is much nicer for stuff like this. Yeah, I don't know. Get like a weird head going on. You will notice, like, I have this object smooth, and it seams this stuff like really nicely in the back of the UVs. That really is like the beauty of Mudbox or like these 3D painting programs, is because you can just ignore your UVs. I mean, it's still not good to have seams like everywhere, but you can just draw straight across them and not worrying about your textures matching up. So again, this might be something to look into if you want to add like scratches or something to your object. But yeah. But Substance Painter is really good for one, you can actually work with a PBR, physically based rendering materials. So the textures port much more closely into Maya than the stuff that I just showed you from Mudbox. And a lot of times Substance Painter is used for doing game assets, stuff like that. It's really powerful, actually. It's one of the few programs I've actually paid for. But you can also do a cool thing. Instead of like just drawing color or like just drawing specular, you can literally, say you have like an object and you want to throw rust on it, you can be like, cool, my brush now has values for color and roughness and metalness, and I'm just going to paint, and it's just going to like drag all of that stuff onto your model at once. Like it's super, super nice to work with in that way. And again, I think that exists in like 2 of the labs. I'm just not sure which ones. But yeah. Any questions on Mudbox? Cool. I mostly just like using it for bump maps and stuff, honestly. Like even if you just sort of lay out your bump maps as just like a black and white map in they actually also have a channel for bump, which bump. So you can actually make your own bump maps. So I'll just be like, all right, this person has like a giant face scar. Perfect. That is so ugly. Export. All right. So I'm just curious to see what happens if I add this glorious bump map in here. It's been a while. I remember last time I added a bump map for Mudbox, it like did some kind of weird stuff, but it like didn't show up very well. But may as well try it. But yeah, so you can draw bump maps and stuff, which again, good for scratches if you want to do stuff like that for this assignment. But yeah. The editor. Oh my God, you have too many tabs open. But yeah. So that's honestly pretty much Mudbox. Does anyone have any questions about like any of this or how to like use this for your assignment? Glorious bump map. Alright. Is there anything else that people want to go over for texturing this week? Again, like how to make specific textures or anything like that? Any other random Maya things, shapes to make, etc.? Alright. Cool. I think that's pretty much it. The only thing that I can think of, I said that to you guys, sorry. I mentioned the thing at the beginning of the class where game kids can do low poly models for their finals, right? Okay, cool. In that case, I think I'm done, in which case you're free to go. Also, I can hang out here and answer questions if people want to do stuff, but if you don't have questions, you're free to go. Give me 4 seconds.